In the courts of medieval Europe, a young woman's worth could hinge on something unseen, unproven, and yet obsessively policed her virginity. It was the currency of marriage, the proof of honor, and sometimes the difference between life and death. Behind castle walls and church altars, bizarre tests, humiliating rituals, and ruthless punishments guarded this invisible treasure. Tonight, we uncover the strange, disturbing, and often tragic rules that governed a woman's most private reality in a world where reputation meant survival. By the dawn of the High Middle Ages, between the 11th and 13th centuries, Europe was a continent where the private lives of women were bound to public judgment. Across kingdoms, from the courts of France to the market towns of the Holy Roman Empire, virginity was not merely a personal matter, it was a moral currency, reinforced by church doctrine, sustained by noble politics, and enforced through laws and customs that reached into every corner of society. The church had, by then, become the most powerful cultural force in Europe. Rooted in biblical interpretations and the writings of early church fathers such as Augustine of Hippo and Jerome, Christian teaching elevated virginity as a state of spiritual superiority. Augustine had written that while marriage was honorable, virginity represented a higher calling, one that mirrored the purity of the Virgin Mary. This theological stance became embedded in sermons, canon law, and pastoral guidance. It did not remain confined to monasteries. It flowed into the expectations of noble courts and peasant villagers alike. For noble families, a daughter's virginity was a political asset. Marriage was rarely about love. It was a tool for forging alliances, consolidating land, or securing peace between rival houses. The chastity of a bride was directly tied to the legitimacy of heirs. Any doubt cast over a woman's virginity threatened the integrity of the marriage contract and, by extension, the political stability it was meant to secure. A dishonored match could undo years of negotiation and plunge regions into renewed conflict. The connection between virginity and inheritance law was particularly visible in England after the Norman conquest. Noble women who entered marriage with a reputation for chastity brought greater dowries and commanded more advantageous alliances. If a noblewoman's premarital conduct was questioned, her family could see property claims weakened, as accusations of infidelity before marriage could be manipulated into challenges to a child's legitimacy. In rural communities, where life was far removed from the pageantry of court, the stakes were different but no less severe. Among peasants, marriage often tied families together through the exchange of land use rights, livestock, or labor agreements. Even without vast estates, a woman's sexual reputation could still determine her value as a wife and the security of her children. In some parts of Europe, including parts of Germanic territories, folk customs dictated public acknowledgement of a bride's virginity on the wedding night as proof to the community that the marriage was valid. Religion did not simply praise virginity. It enforced it through an intricate web of moral teaching and legal authority. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 codified many aspects of Christian marriage, insisting on public ceremonies and bans to prevent secret unions. While the Council's main aim was to protect the sacrament of marriage, it also reinforced the idea that a woman's sexual history was the concern of the wider community, not just her family. The moral weight placed on virginity was not universal across all of medieval Europe. In parts of southern Europe, particularly in the more cosmopolitan cities of the Italian states, merchant wealth and urban culture sometimes allowed for more discreet handling of sexual scandals, though reputations were still fragile. In the north, especially in regions with strong feudal bonds, such as France and England. The scrutiny was harsher and more public. Class shaped the experience of these rules. A princess accused of premarital indiscretion might be forced into a convent to preserve her family's dignity, while a peasant girl in the same situation could be publicly shamed or, in some cases, legally compelled to marry the man in question, regardless of her wishes. For women of the emerging merchant class, virginity was linked to economic ambition. Respectable marriage into a higher-ranking family could expand trade networks and secure contracts, making chastity a form of investment. Punishments for women who defied these expectations were severe. In England, records from the manorial courts of the 13th and 14th centuries show fines imposed for fornication, a term that covered any sexual relations outside of marriage. In parts of Scandinavia, loss of virginity outside marriage could strip a woman of certain inheritance rights. In Castile, legal codes like the Siete Partidas, compiled under Alfonso Vetz in the mid-13th century, upheld the protection of a woman's honor as a matter of legal importance, allowing for compensation or retribution if her chastity was violated. Yet the obsession was not only enforced from above. Communities themselves policed women's reputations through gossip, public rituals, and witness testimony. A neighbor's accusation could travel quickly, damaging prospects and forcing families into defensive measures. In some towns, marriage contracts included explicit clauses affirming the bride's virginity, a statement that could later be used in legal disputes. The pressure reached its most symbolic expression in the veneration of the Virgin Mary. Churches across Europe filled with imagery of her immaculate purity, and sermons often held her up as the ultimate model for all women, regardless of their station. The result was a moral ideal that could never be fully met: the expectation of absolute chastity before marriage, followed by unquestioned fidelity afterward. This cultural obsession was reinforced through education and upbringing. Girls in noble households were often taught the value of modesty, restraint, and silence, while boys were instructed to protect their sisters' and daughters' honor as part of their duty. In rural areas, these lessons were learned through communal norms and seasonal festivities that marked key stages in courtship and marriage. The fixation on virginity was at its core a reflection of a society built on inheritance, legitimacy, and moral authority. In a world where the Church defined morality, where political power hinged on bloodlines, and where women's legal autonomy was sharply limited, the sexual history of a single person could influence the fate of entire families, even kingdoms. The body of a young woman became a site where theology, law, and politics converged, and where the stakes could be life, death, or lifelong confinement. By the end of the Middle Ages, these attitudes would begin to shift under the pressures of economic change, the Renaissance, and the Reformation. But in the centuries before, virginity was more than a private condition. It was a public matter, scrutinized and guarded as if it were the foundation stone of medieval order itself. In medieval Europe, virginity was never a simple state of being. It could be a blessing that lifted women to revered positions, or a burden that trapped them in lives they had not chosen. The same condition that could sanctify a queen or saint could also condemn a peasant girl to humiliation or lifelong confinement. For the noble elite, purity was currency. A daughter's untouched body represented security for dynasties, ensuring that any child she bore would be unquestionably legitimate. In the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, the value of a noblewoman's marriage contract could rise or fall on the certainty of her chastity. Families sometimes negotiated years in advance, pledging daughters who were still in infancy, while carefully guarding their reputations until the wedding. Queens were perhaps the most visible examples of this high-stakes exchange. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, carried her status as a chaste maiden into her first marriage with Louis VII of France in 1137. Though her political influence grew, the pressure for a pure queen to produce heirs became relentless. When her marriage to Louis ended without a surviving son, the whispers of divine displeasure and questions about her role in the union's failure contributed to the annulment. In the court's eyes, her virginity had once secured her value. Later, her reproductive record diminished it. The Church amplified this paradox. While theologians and preachers praised virginity as a spiritual ideal, it was also a tool for control. Women who entered convents as brides of Christ were celebrated for rejecting the world's temptations. In many cases, these women were from noble families, placed in religious houses not purely out of piety but to protect political interests or avoid the expense of a dowry. The 12th century Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, revered for her intellect and visions, entered monastic life at a young age, a decision influenced by her family's social standing as much as personal devotion. Yet the cloister could be both sanctuary and cage. A nun's vow of chastity freed her from the dangers and uncertainties of childbirth, but it also locked her into a life under strict ecclesiastical authority. In some cases, noble women were confined to convents against their will to prevent them from making marriages that might disrupt family alliances. The very status that made them holy also made them politically neutral, removing them from the dynastic chessboard. Outside the aristocracy, the same ideal of purity governed the lives of ordinary women, but without the protective walls of privilege. In villages and market towns, a young woman's reputation was policed not just by her family, but by neighbors, employers, and the parish priest. For peasant girls, loss of virginity outside marriage could be catastrophic. Marriage prospects diminished, dowries became harder to secure, and in some places, local courts could impose fines or force the woman to wed the man involved. Even in cases of coercion, the concept of purity as leverage was also visible in the legal codes of the time. In England, a woman's eligibility to inherit certain properties could depend on her chastity at the time of marriage. The 13th century Siete Partidas of Castile treated a woman's virginity as a form of property belonging to her family, with violations punishable by law. Such statutes underscored the belief that virginity was not solely a personal attribute, but an asset with measurable value in the social and economic order. The Church's influence meant that purity was imbued with theological meaning as well. The Virgin Mary was held up as the ultimate model, her life interpreted as proof that sexual restraint brought divine favor. This ideal extended to noble women expected to embody Marian virtues, and even to peasant girls urged by confessors to guard their honor as a moral duty. Theologians such as Thomas Aquinas argued that while marriage was sacred, virginity was a superior state, a belief that reinforced a hierarchy in which women's highest spiritual calling was to remain untouched. Yet, this elevation came with its own trap. A woman celebrated for her chastity before marriage was expected to transition seamlessly into a life of marital obedience, bearing children and managing a household. The qualities that made her virtuous as a maiden, restraint, seclusion, and modesty, were not always compatible with the demands of marriage and court politics. Those who failed to meet these competing expectations risked disgrace. Royal scandals revealed the fragility of this ideal. In 1314, the infamous Tour de Nesle affair shook the French court. Two daughters-in-law of King Philip IV, Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, were accused of adultery after being observed meeting lovers in secret. The accusations, fueled by court rivalries, led to their imprisonment and the annulment of one marriage. The scandal tarnished the royal family's honor and underscored how quickly the celebrated virtue of purity could be stripped away, and with it, political stability. Purity could also be wielded as a weapon in personal disputes. Accusations of lost virginity, whether true or false, could ruin a woman's prospects and be used to manipulate her family. In some inheritance disputes, male relatives used claims of premarital indiscretion to challenge the legitimacy of heirs, thereby redirecting property or titles. Even within the church, where virginity was most exalted, its weaponization was evident. Religious women accused of breaking their vows could face severe punishment, including lifelong penance or confinement. In 15th century Spain, the rise of moral discipline campaigns under ecclesiastical reformers placed increased scrutiny on convent life, with investigations into suspected breaches of chastity becoming more common. Purity was a paradox. It could secure a crown, a dowry, or a respected place in the cloister. But it also served as a means of confinement, surveillance, and control. Women were praised for maintaining it and punished for losing it, sometimes regardless of their consent or circumstance. This double-edged standard reinforced the patriarchal structure of medieval Europe, where a woman's body could symbolize the honor of a dynasty, the virtue of a community, or the sanctity of the church, yet rarely her own autonomy. The legacy of purity as both power and prison was visible in the way women were remembered. Saints like Agnes of Rome and Clare of Assisi were venerated for their unwavering chastity. Their lives held up as examples for centuries. Others, like Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, were remembered for the loss of it, their names attached to scandal long after their deaths. Both fates illustrate how, in the medieval world, virginity was never just a personal matter. It was a public stage on which reputation, politics, and morality were relentlessly played out. In medieval Europe, a woman's virginity was often treated not as a matter of private conscience, but as a fact to be proven, sometimes in public, sometimes through deeply invasive means. The so-called tests devised to verify this state ranged from the merely humiliating to the dangerously harmful. None had any scientific validity, yet they carried immense weight in courtrooms, noble halls, and village gossip. The most common belief rested on the assumption of a physical barrier, the hymen as a visible and reliable sign of virginity. Physicians of the era, inheriting theories from ancient Greek and Roman medical writers, claimed that the intactness of this tissue confirmed sexual inexperience. Yet the actual anatomy was poorly understood. Texts such as those by Galen and later medieval commentators contained vague and contradictory descriptions, often mixed with moral judgments. There was no recognition that physical activity, illness, or simply natural variation could alter this tissue. Still, the presence or absence of the hymen was treated as decisive evidence. Examinations were carried out by trusted women, usually midwives or matrons appointed by a court or a noble household. Their role was not purely medical. They were guardians of social honor, tasked with defending the family's reputation or the legitimacy of heirs. In legal disputes over marriage contracts, inheritance, or accusations of sexual misconduct. These women might be called to perform an inspection and deliver a sworn statement. Records from English ecclesiastical courts in the 14th and 15th centuries show how these examinations were formalized. In some cases, multiple matrons would be summoned to ensure consensus. Their findings could sway verdicts in annulment proceedings, where a marriage might be dissolved if a husband claimed his wife had concealed a lack of virginity. In such cases, the woman's body became direct evidence in a legal battle with little regard for her dignity or consent. The process itself could be crude, without modern understanding of anatomy or hygiene. The examination was based on sight and touch, interpreted through layers of superstition. Some believed that a true virgin would flinch in pain during the inspection, or that the vaginal opening would be visibly smaller. Others added nonsensical requirements that a virgin's urine would be clear, her voice higher, or her gait more modest. These ideas, repeated in medical treatises and moral handbooks, turned folklore into supposed diagnostic criteria. Beyond physical inspection, medieval Europe nurtured a variety of mythical tests. In parts of France and Italy, it was said that a virgin could run or jump without discomfort, while a non-virgin would feel pain or show awkwardness. Another belief claimed that the pulse at a woman's wrist would change when certain parts of her body were touched, revealing hidden sexual history. These notions often blended with humoral theory, the dominant medical framework which linked bodily fluids and temperaments to moral qualities. Under such thinking, chastity was not only a virtue but a physical state observable through signs and symptoms. In royal courts, the stakes were amplified. A disputed claim to virginity could jeopardize alliances and succession. In England, still carrying the medieval legacy, Catherine of Aragon's marriage to Henry VIII was scrutinized, partly on the question of whether her union with his brother Arthur had been consummated. While no invasive examination of Catherine was recorded, the logic behind the inquiry reflected the same assumptions that underpinned medieval virginity testing, that the body could be read for proof, and that such proof could determine the fate of kingdoms. One of the most publicly degrading customs was the display of the proof of consummation, often a blood-stained sheet after a wedding night. In some regions, particularly among the nobility, this cloth was shown to relatives, or even townsfolk, as visible confirmation of the bride's prior chastity. The absence of blood could trigger accusations, investigations, or even annulments. Modern medical knowledge shows that many women do not bleed during first intercourse, but in the medieval period, failure to produce the expected sign could be catastrophic. The role of midwives in these matters was complex. While they were often instruments of the system, some used their authority to shield women from harsher consequences. Historical accounts from the Low Countries suggest that sympathetic examiners sometimes declared a woman intact despite ambiguous findings, especially when they believed the accusation was motivated by malice. But such acts of protection were risky. Contradicting a nobleman's or court's expectation could lead to accusations of deceit. Physicians, though fewer in number than midwives, also became involved, especially in higher profile cases. Learned doctors might be summoned to give an expert opinion, citing ancient authorities alongside their own observations. Yet their methods differed little from those of lay examiners. The veneer of scholarly language masked the same flawed premises, that virginity was a measurable physical state rather than a social construct enforced through ritual and law. Some trials took on theatrical qualities. In certain Italian city-states, During the late Middle Ages, accusations of lost virginity could be contested in public hearings, where the woman would be examined behind a curtain while male officials awaited the verdict. These events blurred the line between legal procedure and spectacle, feeding public curiosity and reinforcing communal control over women's sexuality. The dangers of these practices were not merely social. Invasive examinations, conducted without understanding of anatomy or sterilization, could cause injury or infection. The emotional toll was severe, as women faced not only physical violation, but also the possibility of lifelong stigma. In a society where reputation could determine survival, the outcome of such a test could mean the difference between marriage, exile, or destitution. Superstitions about virginity also extended into criminal justice. In some jurisdictions, women accused of sexual crimes were examined to establish whether they had been virgins beforehand, with the implicit belief that a virgin's rape was more serious than that of a non-virgin. This hierarchy of victimhood reflected the underlying logic of purity culture, that a woman's worth was tied to her sexual status, and that her body could be assessed like property. By the late medieval period, skepticism toward these methods began to emerge among a few physicians and jurists. Some recognized the variability of anatomy and the impossibility of certainty. Yet these voices were rare, and the cultural weight of tradition ensured that virginity tests persisted well into the early modern era. The practices were rooted less in genuine medical inquiry than in the needs of a patriarchal system to police women's bodies and control lineage. What stands out in the historical record is the sheer endurance of these beliefs. Whether in the private chambers of a noble court, the back room of a village midwife, or the public stage of a legal hearing, the pursuit of proof was shaped more by fear and control than by truth. The pseudoscience gave authority to rituals that reinforced the social order, making women's bodies sites of both scrutiny and symbolic power. The trials of the body were, in the end, less about discovering facts than about enforcing boundaries. They served to affirm male authority, to protect property rights in marriage and inheritance, and to maintain the moral narrative promoted by the Church. For the women subjected to them, these tests were not moments of neutral inquiry, but episodes of judgment that could alter the course of their lives in an instant. In much of medieval Europe, the marriage bed was not entirely private. In certain regions and social classes, the morning after a wedding carried an expectation that a tangible sign of consummation be shown to witnesses. The proof most often sought was a blood-stained sheet, presented as visible evidence that the bride had entered the marriage a virgin and that the union had been physically sealed. The ritual varied from place to place. In parts of France, especially in rural areas, the newlyweds' bedclothes were carried from the chamber to a gathering of relatives or neighbors. Sometimes this was done discreetly. In other cases, it became a public display, with guests inspecting the cloth and offering congratulations. Among the nobility, where marriages were instruments of diplomacy, the practice could take on a formal, almost ceremonial character. The logic behind the ritual rested on two intertwined assumptions. First, that an intact hymen would be torn during first intercourse, producing blood. Second, that this physical sign confirmed both the woman's chastity and the legitimacy of future heirs. Modern medicine has shown that neither claim is reliable. Many women do not bleed, while others might bleed for reasons unrelated to virginity, but in the medieval mindset, absence of blood was treated as a serious matter. When the expected proof failed to appear, the consequences could be severe. In some communities, it triggered gossip and informal shaming. In noble courts, it could spark formal disputes, annulments, or political crises. Since alliances often hinged on marriage contracts, a challenge to a bride's virginity was not simply a personal accusation. It could be an attack on the honor and credibility of her entire family. One of the more notorious examples occurred in 15th century Brittany. Duke Francis II arranged the marriage of his daughter Margaret to Aling Viscount of Rohan in 1462. Soon after the wedding, Aling claimed that the marriage had not been consummated and accused Margaret of concealing a prior union. While the details of what was displayed or not displayed remain uncertain, the absence of public proof fed the dispute. The matter escalated into a prolonged legal battle that damaged relations between two of the region's most powerful houses. Elsewhere, records from Burgundian towns in the late Middle Ages describe cases where grooms brought complaints to civic or ecclesiastical courts after a wedding night without the expected bloodstain. These complaints sometimes included testimony from women who had inspected the sheet or the bride's body the following morning. Such testimonies carried considerable weight. The word of respected matrons could sway judges toward granting an annulment, freeing the groom from the marriage and, in many cases, allowing him to retain the dowry. The ritual also appeared in legal codes in certain German principalities. Written marriage agreements included clauses about consummation and proof of honor, though they stopped short of prescribing exactly how the proof should be shown. In practice, the blood-stained sheet served as a physical token that these agreements had been fulfilled. In rare instances, absence of proof led to restitution claims, where the bride's family was compelled to return part of the dowry or provide additional compensation. Among the lower classes, the practice could be less formal but more socially punishing. In villages, a wedding night without the expected display could fuel lasting reputational damage. For women, this might mean fewer opportunities for economic support if widowed or abandoned. For men, it could be a source of mockery, especially if the lack of proof was taken to suggest impotence rather than infidelity. In either case, the public nature of the custom meant that private matters became subject to communal judgment. Not all cultures within medieval Europe followed the ritual strictly. In Italian city-states, like Florence or Venice, elite families often valued discretion over public display, especially in politically sensitive matches. The absence of a sheet ceremony there did not imply a lesser concern for chastity. The issue could still arise in legal or diplomatic disputes, but it did spare couples the immediate pressure of providing physical evidence to a crowd. Royal and noble courts, however, often weaponized the custom when advantageous. In 1613, the French court witnessed a scandal involving the marriage of Gaston, Duke of Orleans, to Marie de Bourbon, Duchess of Montpensier. Though this occurred in the early modern period, it echoed medieval concerns. Rumors spread that the marriage had not been consummated, with quiet references to the absence of proof. Political factions hostile to the match used these whispers to undermine the union, illustrating how the wedding night sheet tradition had long served as a political lever. The ritual also intersected with the Church's role in marriage. Canon law required consummation for a marriage to be considered in annulment proceedings, especially in noble cases. Absence of the expected signs from the wedding night could be presented as supporting evidence, while the Church did not formally endorse the sheet display as proof. Clerical courts often heard testimony about it. These proceedings could involve invasive questioning of both bride and groom, and occasionally physical examinations reminiscent of virginity tests. Sometimes, the ritual served less as a check on the bride's past than as a reassurance of the groom's virility. In cultures where producing heirs was paramount, the ability to consummate a marriage was a public expectation for men of status. A blood-stained sheet could silence speculation about impotence as much as it could confirm a bride's chastity. Despite its cultural entrenchment, the custom was not without critics, even in the medieval period. Some physicians and clerics pointed out the unreliability of bleeding as an indicator of virginity. Others argued that such public displays were immodest and violated the privacy of the marital bond. But these objections rarely overturned the tradition, especially in rural communities where communal oversight of moral life was a deeply ingrained norm by the late Middle Ages. Economic and political changes began to erode the custom in some areas. The rise of more complex legal contracts, the influence of Renaissance humanism, and shifting attitudes toward personal privacy reduced the frequency of public sheet displays among the elite. Still, in many rural parts of Europe, the practice persisted well into the early modern era. The wedding night sheet ritual was more than a quaint or curious tradition. It was a public checkpoint in a system that bound marriage to property, lineage, and honor. Failure to produce the expected proof could unravel alliances, cost families fortunes, and permanently stain reputations. For women, the burden was immense. The absence of a small patch of blood on a piece of linen could negate a lifetime of obedience and conformity to social expectations. In the larger history of medieval sexuality and marriage, the ritual stands as a stark example of how private life was made subject to public verification, and how myths about the body became tools of social control. In an age where reputation could shape destiny, the linen sheet was more than fabric. It was evidence, currency, and weapon all at once. In medieval Europe, the question of virginity was not left solely to families, the church, or community opinion. It was embedded in law, civil, canon, and customary, and the consequences for breaking its rules could range from fines to public humiliation, forced marriage, or even death. The legal system did more than reflect purity culture. It actively enforced it. Canon law, shaped over centuries and formalized in the Decretum Gratiani in the 12th century, established the moral framework. Sexual relations outside of marriage were classified as fornication, a sin requiring confession and penance. But the Church's reach extended beyond the spiritual. In many parts of Europe, ecclesiastical courts handled cases of premarital sex, seduction, and broken betrothals, issuing judgments that carried social and economic weight. A woman who lost her virginity before marriage might be ordered to marry the man responsible or receive financial compensation in place of marriage, a remedy meant to restore her honor in the eyes of the community. Civil and customary laws operated alongside ecclesiastical rulings, often with harsher penalties. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, municipal codes like the Sachsenspiegel and Schwabenspiegel treated seduction of a virgin as both a moral wrong and an offense against her family's property rights. Compensation was owed not just to the woman, but to her father or guardian, reflecting the idea that her chastity had economic value. In practice, wealthier families could use these laws to secure settlements, while poorer women had little power to enforce them. In rural communities, where local custom often carried more weight than written law, punishments could be informal, but severe. In England's manorial courts during the 13th and 14th centuries, Fines for fornication were common, and women accused multiple times could face public penance, standing barefoot before the church, dressed in penitential garments, while the congregation looked on. These rituals were designed to restore moral order by making the offender a visible example. Urban centers tended to formalize enforcement. In Italian city-states, civic statutes often prescribed monetary penalties for men who seduced unmarried women, with higher sums required if the woman was of noble or patrician birth. Venice's statutes, revised in the late 13th century, included provisions allowing a woman's relatives to bring charges on her behalf. Yet these protections were uneven. In some cases, the courts reduced penalties if the accused man offered marriage, a solution that, in reality, often coerced women into unions they did not want. The law also tied virginity to questions of inheritance and legitimacy. In England, under common law, if a marriage was found to be invalid due to pre-contract or illicit relations before the wedding, any children from that union could be declared illegitimate and barred from inheriting. This made the question of a bride's virginity a legal matter with far-reaching consequences for land, titles, and political alliances. Noble families were especially vigilant, sometimes using the courts to challenge the validity of a rival's heirs by raising accusations about the mother's premarital conduct. Some of the harshest punishments came under secular criminal law. In regions where honor codes were tightly bound to local governance, in parts of Castile during the reign of Alfonso X in the 13th century, the Siete Partidas set out penalties for abduction or seduction of virgins, including corporal punishment, or death for offenders in aggravated cases. Though these provisions were ostensibly designed to protect women, they also reinforced the principle that a woman's chastity was a possession to be defended, sometimes violently, by her male relatives. Execution for loss of virginity before marriage was rare but not unheard of, especially in cases conflated with adultery or defilement of a noble house. In the laws of some German principalities, a woman convicted of repeated fornication could face banishment, flogging, or, in extreme cases, drowning, a punishment sometimes associated with moral offenses. While not the norm, the existence of such penalties demonstrates the severity with which some communities approached breaches of sexual conduct. The law's treatment of sexual offenses was also shaped by class. A noble woman accused of losing her virginity before marriage might be sent to a convent, an act framed as pious redemption, but often a strategic withdrawal from public life to protect family honor. A peasant woman in the same position could be compelled to work without wages for the offended family, or married off quickly, often to a man willing to accept her reduced value in exchange for a smaller dowry. Urban merchant families, concerned with reputation in trade as much as in marriage, sometimes arranged quiet settlements to prevent public trials that could harm business. The handling of rape cases further revealed the law's fixation on virginity. In many jurisdictions, the crime was considered more serious if the victim was a virgin, and damages awarded to her family were correspondingly higher. In England, the 1285 Statute of Westminster prescribed harsher sentences for rape of a maiden under 12, an age tied to the canon law minimum for marriage. But the focus remained on her marriageability, not her autonomy. This hierarchy created a disturbing legal reality. The harm was measured less by the act itself than by the perceived loss of future marital and economic prospects. Enforcement was inconsistent. In rural areas, where law was administered locally and personal relationships often influenced outcomes, Some cases were dropped or resolved informally. In cities with established courts, records show a more regular pattern of enforcement, but outcomes still depended on the social standing of those involved. Wealthy families could pay fines or arrange marriages to resolve accusations, while poorer defendants might face corporal punishment or imprisonment. Even within the church, enforcement varied. Some bishops pushed for strict application of canon law against fornication, while others focused on public penance without legal consequences. Monastic chroniclers occasionally criticized secular authorities for leniency toward the wealthy, a complaint echoed in civic records that show lighter fines for influential defendants. By the late Middle Ages, changing economic structures and the rise of centralized monarchies began to shift legal attitudes. In France, under Charles VII, reforms in the mid-15th century brought some sexual offences under the crown's jurisdiction, reducing the role of local lords, while the core ideals about virginity remained intact. The consolidation of legal authority meant that enforcement became more standardized, at least in theory still. Across the medieval world, the connection between virginity and the law endured. It shaped the fate of marriages, determined the legitimacy of heirs, and reinforced a hierarchy where women's bodies were subject to regulation at every level, from the parish court to the king's council, whether in a rural manorial hearing or a grand trial in a royal palace. The question of virginity was never just personal. It was legal property, moral capital, and political currency all at once. In medieval Europe, marriage was rarely a private arrangement between two people. It was a transaction, a calculated exchange of wealth, land, and alliances, and at the center of this marketplace stood the bride, her value often determined not by her skills, character, or even beauty, but by the belief in her untouched chastity. Virginity was treated as a form of economic capital, one that could raise or ruin a woman's worth. In negotiations, the dowry was the most visible financial element of this system, originating in Roman law and entrenched in Christian Europe by the early Middle Ages. The dowry was property or money brought by a bride to her husband's household. It served both as a contribution to the new marriage and as a safeguard for the wife, meant to support her if widowed. The size of the dowry often reflected the social and political ambitions of the families involved. For noble houses, it was a strategic investment. A daughter who could marry into a powerful family might be given vast tracts of land, valuable livestock, or even castles as part of her dowry, provided her virginity was beyond question. Rumors or accusations about a bride's sexual history could have immediate financial consequences. In 14th century Florence, marriage contracts frequently included clauses affirming the bride's virginity, and if a groom later claimed deception, the bride's family risked losing part or all of the dowry. The stakes were so high that disputes over these claims sometimes reached the city's mercantile courts, where economic damage to the groom's household was argued alongside questions of personal honor. In rural communities, where cash was scarce, dowries were often paid in goods, grain, farm animals, clothing, and household tools. Even here, virginity mattered. A dishonored bride might be married off quickly for a smaller dowry to avoid public scandal, effectively lowering her market price. Families without means to provide large dowries sometimes relied on their daughter's reputation as a substitute form of value, hoping that her perceived purity would attract a husband who could afford to support her. Bride price the payment, made by a groom or his family to the bride's family, existed alongside the dowry in some regions, particularly in parts of early medieval Germany, Scandinavia, and among certain rural communities in Eastern Europe. While the Church encouraged the dowry system as more in line with Christian ideals, bride price persisted in practice. Here too, virginity influenced the amount paid. A proven virgin could command a higher price, reflecting both the family's honor and the perceived security of legitimate heirs. Inheritance laws added another layer to this economic calculus. In many parts of Europe, daughters received their share of the family estate as a dowry, which meant that securing a respectable marriage for them was essential to maintaining the family's economic standing. In England, under common law, if a marriage was later annulled due to allegations about a bride's chastity, her dowry, often her only portion of the inheritance, could be withheld. Among the nobility, where property transfers could shift political balances, accusations about virginity could become tools in larger power struggles. The marketplace of brides was not limited to noble halls. In growing medieval cities, wealthy merchant families used marriage to solidify business alliances. The financial negotiations could be as complex as those among the aristocracy, and here too, a bride's reputation was a bargaining chip. A scandal, whether true or fabricated, could undermine years of commercial strategy. Surviving letters from merchant correspondents in 15th century Italy reveal fathers warning their sons against marrying women whose honor is not certain, equating marital alliances with financial risk management. In this economy, information and misinformation was powerful. Gossip could destroy value overnight. In small villages, where everyone's movements were visible, even an innocent meeting between an unmarried woman and a man could start rumors. In cities, rival families sometimes spread accusations to sabotage marriage negotiations, knowing that doubts about virginity were difficult to dispel. Without modern means of disproving such claims, the damage was often permanent. Among the aristocracy, this weaponization of reputation could extend to international politics. In 1469, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united two powerful kingdoms, but before their union, both courts scrutinized rumors about the other's prospective spouse. Though Isabella's chastity was affirmed, the fact that it was even investigated shows how political alliances demanded verification of purity as much as legal agreements. The human cost of this economic system was considerable. For women, virginity was both an asset and a liability, something to be guarded obsessively, yet something they could lose through no fault of their own, whether by coercion, assault, or malicious slander. For families, a daughter's perceived purity could mean the difference between economic stability and ruin. The transaction was rarely fair. In cases where marriages collapsed over disputes about virginity, women could be left without their dowries and without the social standing to secure another match. The market of brides also created a space where the church, the courts, and the community intersected. The church insisted on the sacrament of marriage and the spiritual ideal of chastity, while the courts enforced contractual obligations and property transfers tied to it. Communities, meanwhile, policed reputation through gossip and custom, acting as both witnesses and enforcers. Over time, the rigid economics of this system began to shift. By the late Middle Ages, in parts of Western Europe, the rise of urban economies and more fluid social mobility allowed some families to arrange marriages on the strength of wealth alone, with less emphasis on reputation. But this change was slow, and in many rural regions, The valuation of a bride's virginity remained central well into the early modern period. In the medieval market of brides, purity was treated as a commodity, assessed, priced, and traded. Like land or livestock, its value could be amplified by wealth and titles, or diminished by whispers and suspicion. And though it was spoken of as a moral quality, it functioned as an economic one, shaping the fortunes of families and, in some cases, altering the political map of Europe. By the High Middle Ages, the Church had elevated virginity to the highest state a woman could attain. Above marriage, above motherhood, above any worldly achievement, stood the image of the untouched bride, not of a mortal man, but of Christ himself. The concept of the Sponsa Christi, the bride of Christ, was central to the religious orders that drew women into lives of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Convents had existed in Europe since the early spread of Christianity, but by the 12th and 13th centuries, they had become not only spiritual centers, but also critical parts of the social order. For noble families, placing a daughter in a convent could serve multiple purposes: fulfilling religious vows, securing spiritual prestige, and avoiding the financial burden of a dowry in a marriage alliance. Entry into these communities was framed as a calling, yet for many women it was a decision shaped as much by politics and economics as by personal faith. The vow of chastity, taken alongside vows of poverty and obedience, symbolized a complete renunciation of worldly ties. Women who professed this vow were said to marry Christ in a symbolic ceremony, receiving a ring and sometimes a crown as signs of this spiritual union. Religious writings celebrated these brides of Christ as living reflections of the Virgin Mary, whose perpetual virginity was held up as the supreme model of holiness. The cult of virgin saints grew from this ideal. Figures such as Agnes of Rome, Cecilia, and Lucy were venerated across Europe, their hagiographies emphasizing steadfast refusal to surrender their chastity, often in the face of persecution or death. Their stories, retold in sermons and devotional literature, reinforced the message that virginity was worth more than life itself. These accounts were not confined to antiquity. New virgin saints were canonized in the medieval period, including Clare of Assisi, co-founder of the Poor Clares, whose strict observance of poverty and chastity inspired followers across Italy and beyond. Some of these women achieved significant influence. Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess in 12th century Germany, corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, and her visions and theological writings shaped debates within the Church. Her authority rested in part on her reputation for sanctity and virginity, which made her voice acceptable in an era when women were often excluded from public teaching. The paradox was clear. Chastity could strip a woman of worldly freedom, yet it could also grant her a form of spiritual and moral authority unavailable to most others. But the path to the cloister was not always voluntary. In many noble families, younger daughters were directed into religious life so that estates and titles could pass intact to male heirs. This practice was especially common in regions where dowries for marriage were prohibitively expensive. Sending a daughter to a convent required a dowry as well, but it was often smaller than that demanded for a prestigious match. In some cases, girls entered monastic life in childhood with little say in their fate. There were also instances where vows of chastity were imposed to resolve political crises. A noblewoman whose engagement was broken, or whose marriage prospects had been ruined by scandal, might be placed in a convent to preserve the family's reputation. Once professed, the vow was binding under canon law, and breaking it could result in excommunication. The religious framing concealed what was often an act of social containment. The Church's teaching on virginity also intersected with miraculous claims. Accounts of virgin births, though not common, appeared in hagiographies, presenting certain saints as conceived without the intervention of a man. These stories echoed the doctrine of the virgin birth of Christ and served to magnify the saints' holiness. While some were symbolic, others were treated as literal events, reinforcing the idea that divine favor was closely tied to sexual purity. Not all vowed virgins were cloistered. Some lived in the world as beguines or anchoresses, women who took private vows without joining a formal order. Beguine communities, especially in the Low Countries, allowed women to live together in chastity and devotion while engaging in charitable work. Anchoresses, such as Julian of Norwich in 14th century England, lived enclosed in small cells attached to churches, dedicating their lives to prayer. These paths offered alternatives to both marriage and the convent, but they still rested on the foundational ideal of virginity. The exaltation of chastity, however, could also turn dangerous. Women who claimed visions or divine revelations were often judged by their adherence to virginity. A chaste visionary might be revered. One whose purity was questioned risked being dismissed as fraudulent or even accused of heresy. In the 15th century, Joan of Arc's claim to divine guidance was tied to her public insistence on her virginity. During her trial, English and Burgundian authorities subjected her to physical examination to verify this claim, aware that if they could discredit her chastity, they could undermine her spiritual authority. Even within convent walls, the vow could be a point of conflict. Accusations of breaking chastity were serious, leading to internal investigations and sometimes the expulsion of accused nuns. In 15th century Spain, reform movements sought to enforce stricter discipline in convents, partly in response to rumors and sometimes realities of relaxed observance. These reforms often coincided with political agendas, as monarchs and bishops sought to bring religious houses under tighter control. The cult of virgin saints also shaped lay devotion. Pilgrims traveled to shrines dedicated to these figures, seeking healing, protection, or intercession in marriage and childbirth. Relics associated with virgin martyrs were believed to possess special powers, and their feast days were celebrated with processions and sermons that reinforced the connection between sexual purity and divine favor. This popular piety ensured that the ideal of the sacred virgin was not confined to the cloister, but permeated the broader culture. Yet the veneration of virginity also carried an implicit warning. The same ideals that elevated certain women to sainthood could be used to confine, silence, or remove others from the public sphere. In medieval Europe, a vow of chastity could be a path to spiritual influence or a tool of political control, sometimes both at once. The distinction between a sacred virgin and a dangerous one often lay not in the vow itself, but in who controlled the narrative surrounding it. By the close of the Middle Ages, the ideal of the bride of Christ remained powerful, even as reformers began to question aspects of monastic life. The Protestant Reformation would later reject the spiritual superiority of virginity, dissolving many convents and ending the formal system that had sustained this ideal for centuries. But in the medieval imagination, the Sacred Virgin was more than a religious figure. She was a symbol of purity, authority, and, in some cases, political containment. Her life shaped as much by the needs of the world as by devotion to God. In a society that bound a woman's worth to her chastity, defiance came at a cost. Yet, throughout the Middle Ages, some women found ways to escape, manipulate, or outright challenge the system that sought to control their bodies and reputations. Their stories appear in chronicles, court records, and scandalous correspondence, some ending in ruin, others in unexpected triumph. One of the most infamous cases erupted in France in 1314, the Tour de Nesle. Affair began with rumors that Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, both daughters-in-law of King Philip IV, were conducting affairs with knights in the royal household. Their alleged meetings took place in a tower along the Seine. Whether the accusations were true or fabricated remains debated, but the consequences were immediate. Margaret was imprisoned in Château Galliard and reportedly died there within a year. Blanche was confined to a convent for the rest of her life. The scandal shook the French monarchy and undermined the marriages of Philip's sons. In the eyes of contemporaries, it was not merely a matter of personal morality, it was a political betrayal, with the women's supposed loss of purity threatening the legitimacy of heirs to the throne. While some acts of defiance were discovered and punished, others succeeded through deception. In 15th century Venice, a patrician woman named Cecilia Venia eloped with her lover, Paolo Quirine, defying her family's plan for a politically advantageous marriage. In a city where marriage contracts were binding economic and political tools, elopement was an act of open rebellion. The Venetian family petitioned the Venetian Senate to annul the match, claiming coercion, but Cecilia testified that she had married willingly. The Senate upheld the union, an unusual victory that showed how persistence and public defense of one's choice could override established custom. Even if rarely, disguise offered another path to freedom. Joan of Arc is best remembered for leading French forces during the 100 Years' War. But her cross-dressing was also a calculated act of defiance against gender and purity norms. While she claimed divine command for wearing men's clothing, the choice had practical implications. It allowed her to move in male-dominated military spaces and may have helped her avoid sexual assault while traveling with soldiers. Her later condemnation by the English-backed court included repeated questioning about her attire, revealing how intertwined issues of dress, chastity, and obedience were in the minds of her judges. Some women used false claims of virginity to protect themselves or secure strategic marriages. In 14th century England, court records show cases where women accused of fornication successfully defended themselves by presenting testimony from community members who vouched for their chastity. These witnesses, often neighbors or relatives, could sway the court's judgment, even when physical proof was absent. In effect, reputation could be rebuilt through collective assertion, turning social networks into tools of resistance. Not all acts of rebellion were about marriage. In the Low Countries, Beguines women who lived in religious communities without taking permanent vows often entered these houses after avoiding or rejecting arranged marriages. While they publicly embraced chastity, some later left too. Marry men of their own choosing, having bypassed years of family control. Because they had never taken binding vows, their departure was legal, even if frowned upon by local clergy. This ability to step in and out of a life of vowed chastity without permanent consequence made beguinages a unique escape route. Political intrigue could also hinge on fabricated charges of impurity. In 15th century England, during the Wars of the Roses, the legitimacy of Edward IV's children was challenged by his rival, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard claimed that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry another woman before wedding Elizabeth Woodville. making their union invalid. While the accusation centered on Edward's actions, it cast indirect suspicion on Elizabeth, implying her marriage, and by extension, her role as a chaste, lawful queen, was a fraud. The claim allowed Richard to declare the princes illegitimate and seize the throne as Richard III. Some cases blurred the line between resistance and survival. In certain rural communities, women accused of premarital sex could avoid punishment by marrying their partners quickly, regardless of prior consent. In a few recorded cases, women manipulated this expectation to their advantage, using accusations to force reluctant lovers into marriage, thereby securing economic stability. These strategies were risky, as they relied on the cooperation of local courts or elders, but when successful, they turned the mechanisms of control into tools for self-determination. Royal mistresses occupied a particularly precarious position. In this landscape, while their relationships with kings openly defied the ideal of chastity, their influence could rival that of queens. Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France in the mid-15th century, wielded significant political sway. Though chroniclers criticized her morality, Charles rewarded her with wealth and titles, signaling that royal favor could shield and even legitimize the breaking of purity norms, at least temporarily, but such protection was fragile. Mistresses often faced ruin when their patrons died or withdrew support. In some instances, women's defiance became the stuff of popular legend. In medieval Castile, the story of Dona Lambra de Beraba, preserved in epic poetry, told of a noblewoman whose alleged affair set off a chain of feuds and battles. While heavily romanticized, the tale reflected a cultural fascination with women who transgressed sexual boundaries, whether through choice or slander. These narratives, even when fictionalized, kept alive the idea that purity rules could be bent, broken, or exposed as instruments of power. The Church, too, saw challenges to its authority over chastity. Some nuns, dissatisfied with the restrictions of cloistered life, attempted escape or maintained secret relationships. Records from ecclesiastical visitations, inspections of convents by bishops, include accounts of nuns caught meeting men outside monastery walls or wearing secular clothing. Punishments ranged from penance to permanent enclosure, but the frequency of such cases suggests a quiet undercurrent of resistance within supposedly rigid institutions. Breaking the rules carried undeniable risks. Women who defied expectations could be imprisoned, executed, or confined to convents for life. Yet their actions, whether driven by love, ambition, survival, or conviction, reveal the cracks in a system that claimed to be absolute. Every successful elopement, every false accusation overturned, every disguise that went undetected chipped away at the rigid link between chastity and worth. In the medieval imagination, purity was the foundation of a woman's honor. But these stories show that honor could be redefined, sometimes by bold action, sometimes by careful manipulation of the very customs meant to enforce obedience. The record of these acts, preserved in chronicles, legal archives, and legend, reminds us that even in a world built on strict rules, there were always those willing to break them. By the dawn of the Renaissance, in the 15th century, the foundations of Europe's rigid purity culture began to shift. The change was gradual, uneven, and far from complete. But the forces that had once bound a woman's honor almost entirely to her virginity were slowly losing their grip. Humanist thinkers challenged the medieval worldview by placing greater emphasis on individual worth, education, and personal virtue beyond chastity. Writers such as Erasmus of Rotterdam and Christine de Pizan questioned the moral double standards applied to men and women. Christine's The Book of the City of Ladies, 1405, defended women's capabilities and criticized the narrow measures by which their honor was judged. While she did not reject chastity as a virtue, she argued for a broader recognition of women's value in society. Marriage itself began to evolve. In the late Middle Ages, canon law had already established that consent between the couple was essential for a valid union, even without family approval. The Renaissance brought greater discussion of marriage based on mutual affection, especially among the educated elite. Love poetry, courtly literature, and personal letters from this era reveal an emerging ideal where companionship and compatibility mattered alongside family alliances. Although virginity remained a desirable trait, it was no longer the sole defining factor in some social circles. Scientific advances also eroded the pseudomedical basis of virginity tests. Anatomical studies, made possible by human dissection in universities like Padua and Bologna, began to correct misconceptions about the female body. By the 16th century, anatomists such as Rildo Colombo and later Gabriele Falloppio published works describing reproductive anatomy with unprecedented accuracy. These findings undermined long-held myths about the hymen as an infallible marker of sexual history, while superstition persisted among the general population. The medical community slowly moved away from endorsing such tests as reliable. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century brought its own disruption. Reformers like Martin Luther rejected the notion that celibacy or virginity was inherently superior to marriage, challenging centuries of church teaching that had elevated the virgin state above all others. In Protestant regions, the closure of monasteries and convents ended the formal institution of the Bride of Christ and redirected women's roles toward marriage and family life. While this did not end societal expectations of chastity before marriage, it reframed its purpose as preparation for a godly household rather than a spiritual ideal in itself. Catholic Europe responded with the Counter-Reformation, which reinforced certain aspects of purity culture while attempting to reform abuses. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, reaffirmed the sanctity of marriage, tightened rules on clandestine unions, and continued to extol virginity, especially in the context of sainthood. Yet even within the Catholic world, the growth of urban economies and courtly societies meant that marriage negotiations increasingly factored in wealth, political advantage, and personal charisma, not simply a spotless record of chastity. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries further chipped away at the old order. Philosophers such as Mary Wollstonecraft and Condorcet argued that women's worth should be measured by intellect and moral agency, not sexual history. Legal reforms began to follow, though slowly. In France, revolutionary legislation in the 1790s briefly granted women more equality in marriage and inheritance, while abolishing many of the ecclesiastical courts that had once policed sexual conduct. Similar reforms appeared in parts of Northern Europe, though they were often rolled back in the conservative reaction that followed. Urbanization and industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries transformed the context of courtship and marriage. The mobility of populations, growth of wage labor, and expansion of the press all contributed to a more complex public discourse on sexuality. Romantic love gained ground as a cultural ideal, especially in the burgeoning middle class. Nevertheless, double standards persisted. Women were still expected to be chaste before marriage, while male sexual experience was often overlooked or even tacitly accepted by the late 19th century. Advances in women's education, the suffrage movement, and early feminist activism openly challenged the link between sexual purity and social worth. Campaigners like Josephine Butler in Britain fought to end invasive examinations of women under the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws that had effectively revived medieval-style virginity testing under the guise of public health. Butler's activism reframed the issue as one of human dignity and civil rights, laying groundwork for the eventual dismantling of such practices in the West. Yet the cultural memory of purity laws proved resilient. In many rural areas of Europe, rituals echoing the wedding night sheet tradition survived well into the 20th century. In parts of the Balkans, the display of proof of consummation remained a community expectation, and gossip about a bride's chastity could still affect her family's standing. Even as legal systems moved away from punishing premarital sex, social norms continued to enforce silence, shame, and control in the modern era. The remnants of these medieval ideas appear in subtler forms. Popular culture, family expectations, and religious teachings in various societies still attach moral weight to women's sexual history. The vocabulary may have changed, but the concept that a woman's worth can be tied to her purity persists in certain communities. Legal debates and political rhetoric, the decline of rigid virginity laws from the Renaissance onward was not a clean break, but a centuries-long process. It was shaped by shifts in theology, science, law, and economic life, each eroding part of the old structure while leaving other parts intact. The system that once subjected women to inspections, public shaming, and legal penalties has largely vanished in its original form in most of Europe. But its cultural legacy endures, a reminder of how deeply the medieval purity code was woven into the fabric of social life, and how long its shadow can stretch.